Thanks for coming on a Friday afternoon. Can you guys hear me in the back? Can you guys hear me at the back? Do people usually wear mics in here, or do they just yell at you? Okay. I will yell. It's a whole other world from the Marine Lab, where my biggest class is 18 students. So I'll try and yell, and if I'm not speaking loudly enough, just give me some kind of hand signal from the back. And I apologize to this side of the room. I usually move around a lot, but we're being taped today for the purposes of people who can't be here. And I'm supposed to stay on this side of the room, so I'm not ignoring you. I just want to say something about the genesis of this component of your first year, whatever it is, training modules. I'm not sure what this Friday afternoon session is technically called. It hasn't been done in the past. I teach a research design course for second years out at the Marine Lab, and we do it in first term. Ideally, a research design course would be taught in a first year when you're all panicked about what you're going to do for your MPs, what kind of projects you're going to run. The problem is nobody else wants to teach it. I'm the methods geek. I get really excited about research design, which I will try and impart to you in this short session this afternoon. I have resisted all temptation to try and cram my whole fall course into an hour and 15 minutes. I believe you will thank me for that. But at the same time, I want to be clear that we're not going to leave with a recipe at the end in which you think, aha, here is my MP and I'm off to do it. I'm going to talk about some general issues in doing research design, types of questions you can ask, talk about differences between method and methodology. And then at the end, try and talk about some of what I think are specific challenges to doing the MP in this particular program. And the other thing I want to say about the MP is that everyone gets pretty obsessed with it. You are in a, well, is anyone not obsessed with what they're going to, does anyone know what they're doing for their MP now? Exactly? Okay, and the rest of you sort of not so sure, really would like to know? You're in a course-based program essentially, but the MP is only worth 1.5, like 1.5 times what everything else is worth. Is that right? Something like that, 1 to 2, depending on how you play it. So it's not, you know, the make or break part of this program, but people do get a little bit obsessed with it, and I hope that I can not increase your anxiety about it, but maybe decrease it. With those caveats, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about research, give you some examples of how a research cycle has typically been illustrated, define some of the key terms that I'm going to use today. I like 6-syllable words, so I like to define them. Talk a little bit about positivism and research wars, which I think is a really important issue. It's kind of philosophical and out there, but for an interdisciplinary school where you have people doing a full range of types of projects from hardcore lab-based science, data collection to social science, policy applications in real-world contexts, ecology projects in real-world contexts. I think thinking about positivism and research wars and philosophy is a worthy topic for a Friday afternoon. Then the second half, I'm going to talk more practically about conceptualizing how you might do a research project with the types of inquiry, types of research, and then some of my comments on the master's specific challenge in this program. I'm going to put up a couple of definitions of research, which I'm going to read through, and then we're going to come back to them a little bit later on, and I'm going to test your grammatical skills. Be prepared. So the first one, research is simply a consistent way of asking questions and finding answers to them. Research is a systematic exploration and study in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. Research is the process of systematically seeking answers to questions that are seen to be important by workers in the field. Posing questions and seeking answers is the bedrock of research, and this foundation is shared by all researchers, no matter what their position in the battle over methodology. Do you believe it? There's a battle over methodology. You have to be a methods geek to appreciate that, but we'll talk a little bit about what that battle's all about. And as I said, we'll come back to these definitions, but I just want to start with those 3 general conceptualizations of research. You can see they're not too specific. They're not recipes, but they give you an idea about what we mean in the research process. I'm going to put up a couple of different models. The fine detail of them isn't important. I just want to show you that some of the similarities in the ways people have conceptualized a research cycle, starting at some background theory or some deductions, observations in the real world, developing hypotheses, collecting data, evaluating hypotheses, deciding if they're valid or invalid, and going back up. Another way of showing that, this one is a little bit more complicated, but the similar types of steps, starting with some background area of interest, developing and defining and refining questions that you may turn into a formal hypothesis, moving through some kind of action, the activity of collecting data, evaluating results. Again, coming down to this point of accepting or rejecting, and feedback loops up to the top. Again, as I said, the details of these aren't really important. It's more to get a sense of the familiar structure of a research cycle. A little bit more simplistic, same thing though. Preparation emphasized at the top. You can see they're all sort of a linear process with some feedback mechanisms. Again, this point of acceptance or making conclusions. And finally, the last one I want to look at is a little bit more informal in that it's lacking some of the words like test your hypothesis, reject or accept. It's a more general conception of research, which I think is probably more appropriate for a program in which people are doing really different things. Hypothesis testing is completely appropriate for certain types of research, but often when you're working with human subjects, for example, or doing some kind of policy evaluation, hypothesis testing is a little bit too formalized, a little bit too structured, a little bit too deterministic, and posing broad research questions is more appropriate. So that's why I left off as this is the final one we're looking at. But again, the same process, broad area of interest gets focused down to a central question. We make some conclusions, and all along the way there are these feedback mechanisms. From those, I want to emphasize 2 points that I think are particularly important. The first is that top level, the area of interest, theoretical background, familiarity with the literature, preparation for the project. I think it's important in any types of research, but I'm going to come back to it when I talk about some of the specific challenges for the MEM program and the way MPs sometimes get done. So just keep that in mind. That's one of the commonalities, is that background preparation, familiarity with what's out there is really important. The second component is those feedback mechanisms. The flexibility involved in doing a project where you get started down a different path and it all goes horribly wrong. And accepting that as part of doing research and having to take a few steps back, maybe focus on a different question. One of the first rules of research is what you think you're going to do right now, the 4 or 5 people who think they know exactly what they're going to do. I would say if there's 5 of you, 4 of you won't end up doing exactly what you think you're going to do now. Flexibility in the face of a research project, particularly if you're working outside of a lab environment that you can't really control, access to information that you can't really control. We need some flexibility, some feedback mechanisms to go back to an earlier step without thinking it's all over, I'm doomed. Research changes a lot in the process, and I think accepting that makes the whole process a little bit less painful. I am going to go through a couple of definitions which go from less complicated to more or less familiar to more familiar to less familiar. Method, this is taken out of the dictionary. You're going to say, why are you telling me the definition of method? Dictionary says it's a procedure or process for attaining an object as a way, technique, or process of doing something, blah, blah, blah. My take on this is method describes the tools that you use, whether you're using some kind of instrument to measure a physical phenomena, whether you're using a survey to measure human phenomena, whether you're conducting focus groups, whatever you're doing, that's the tool-based method that you use. Methodology, on the other hand, anyone good at their Latin, Greek origins of language? Put ology on the end of anything and it means study of, theory of, philosophy of. Methodology is really the underlying assumptions or beliefs about the methods that you're using, the philosophy or the theory of the methods that you employ. One way you can think about it is the beliefs about and the principles underlying those tools that you use. So this is going to lead into that discussion of research wars and different approaches to doing research. That one of the reasons I distinguish between method and methodology is because people misuse the terms all the time. When you're describing what you do, use the word method. When you're describing the philosophy or the theory behind what you do, you're talking about methodology. I think this is probably one of my pet peeves, which is why it gets into here. But just being aware that method and methodology are not the same thing, that the actual tool is the method and the methodology is sort of the beliefs, the package of ideas that come with that method. Positivism, many of you are probably familiar with, even if you haven't talked about it specifically, is a philosophy of science that's based on beliefs about how knowledge is created. The definition that the dictionary provides here, knowledge is based on natural phenomena and their properties and relations as verified by the empirical sciences. Empirical sciences, we can measure it, we can count it, we can observe it in real life and objectively tell you, find some kind of truth. So philosophy of science, it says, science is grounded in direct, immediate, and empirically accessible experience of the world. It's repeatable. Replication is guaranteed by the use of scientific method, a specific type of method. It's an established method that is accepted and used by other scientists. So if you're working in a positivist tradition, someone has probably invented the method for you that you pursue. It allows for the formal construction of theory, which, if verified, becomes law. If we went back to our research models, this one is probably one of the most straightforward ones that could work within the context of a positivistic tradition where you're often testing hypotheses. You have a null hypotheses, you collect your data, you evaluate your hypotheses and decide if it's invalid or valid. Really key components of a positivist philosophy of science is the importance of replication. So you do something, someone else could go into the same lab, run the same experiment, get exactly the same results. Replication is key to determining your validity, how much confidence we can have in those results, how much we can believe that you've discovered some kind of truth. And critical to this is that description of method. Whether or not you're doing science classes now, natural science classes now, I'm sure you all remember biology, chemistry, physics labs where your methods and you describe your equipment and everything has to be in great detail. Even though everyone in the room has theoretically done exactly the same thing, we all describe our methods in detail. And that's part of that positivistic tradition, because the only way that we can ensure that person A can replicate what person B did is that description of method. Well, I would argue that this is inherent to positivistic science. It's also one of the issues of research that's most important, being clear, transparent about what it is that you did. Whether or not you believe that anyone could replicate exactly what you've done, that transparency in what it is that you've done is really critical, that description of method. Positivism, though, as I said, is not just an approach using scientific method, describing repeatable experiments in order to replicate and verify results. It's also a philosophy or a methodology, if you like. And some of the beliefs about positivism, first of all, is that there is only one true scientific method. There is only one way to do this. And all training of natural scientists is all about training them in that method so that they can go out and practice positivistic science. The second is that knowledge is neutral. And this comes back to that issue of it's my favorite word, replicability. That one person can produce the same results. There's a neutrality in the knowledge. Knowledge is separate from the process that produced it. The final issue is that the standards of precision and accuracy in the physical sciences offer the only explanatory framework for generating scientific knowledge. We cannot do science of people in the original conceptualization of positivism. We can measure physical phenomena, but human phenomena is more difficult to measure. Now, in this program, there's a wide variation of what people do. Some people do as I said, very strict natural science projects over to the other end of the spectrum of human subjects work, working with policy evaluations. And positivism can be a fairly divisive philosophy to adopt. Because if you're at that, I'm doing natural science in a positivistic manner, then you can kind of look at what other people are doing and say, well, that's not really science. Or that's not really research. And as a social scientist, I, of course, would take offense at this. And one of the things that I think is really important in an interdisciplinary setting and to be a good interdisciplinary research and to fulfill some of the objectives of this program of being able to translate science into policy is to get away from some of these divisive beliefs about the quality or the value of what people do based on something like positivism. There's also been some challenges to the whole notion of positivism. The first, and these are the challenges to those core assumptions about neutrality, knowledge being neutral, and that there's this ultimate truth to be found. Some of this has been questioned by the notion of when we start to think about who determines what gets studied. So for those of you who know what you're doing with your MP already, is anyone working with someone else on a project? A couple of you. So you have an area of interest, but you'll work with someone else to determine what gets studied. Look around the school. Look at who's got big funding grants. Why do they have big funding grants? Is it just because they're more brilliant scientists than other people? Any other reasons we might have particular things being funded and not others? Anyone planning a really government finance career in brainstem research at the moment? There are other issues that determine what gets studied. In North America, out at the Marine Lab, sorry, I'm going to try not to bias this too much towards the Marine Lab, but things like cetacean work, because of the Marine Mammal Act and the money available through that to fund research, may be funded more than work on blue crabs. That we don't just randomly decide that everything is equally out there to be studied. Things like funding and priorities and what the hot issue are determine what we end up looking at. So it kind of calls into the question that that science is just, knowledge is just being generated out there equally across disciplines. We look at particular things and not others. Energy is another good one to look at. In Canada, where I'm originally from, we made a decision as a country in the 1960s to invest in nuclear rather than solar technology. And everyone says, well, solar technology is too expensive. I'm sorry, was nuclear cheap? I don't think it was, but we made that decision. It was a societal, political, industrial, economic decision, and we went forth with it. And the nuclear scientists would have done much better in their granting efforts than people investigating solar cells, for example. So there's that whole issue of this broader societal context in which research is done. The second is, what is the role of the researcher in the study? Who's going to pick something to study that they don't like or they're not interested in? Is anyone here because you're in an environmental program? I have to assume that you have some affinity for some part of the natural environment. I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on you because I know you, but I've forgotten your name. Aaron. And you're doing marine mammal stuff. Hate marine mammals? Like marine mammals? You like marine mammals. And that's okay, right? That's all right. But one of the issues that have come up over things about what's the role of the researcher in the study is how things like liking what you do, and let's all hope that we have job satisfaction and like what we do, can sometimes influence how results are presented and put out there. In the marine turtle world that I'm most familiar with, there was a huge controversy a couple of years ago about the genetic identification of a subspecies of green turtle. Basically, the Pacific green turtle, there was pressure to establish that as a new species of turtle, the black turtle. Anyone guess why would that be useful? Why would having a black turtle be useful? So we've got green turtles, and we're going to divide off this little section and say they're a black turtle. Changes abundance numbers. Green turtles are globally threatened, but in various places, Caribbean, they're doing great, high numbers going up, things like that. If we can carve off a little section on the Pacific coast of Mexico and say that's a different species, they're fewer in number, and the incentive to have higher levels of protection goes up. And it was such a, and this is a documented controversy where the geneticists involved published an article saying that they had come under pressure from the National Science Foundation, from the Marine Turtle Specialist Group, from a variety of professional organizations to reinterpret their data, which suggested that the black turtle was not a separate species, to say that it was. So we have real-life cases where this neutral, stand-back scientist has been challenged. And it's not, we strive for objectivity, we strive for presenting science in as unbiased a fashion as we can, but there are issues that can come into play with that. So it undermines this notion that science just occurs in this vacuum, that we put it out there, and that we don't try and interpret it as individuals, as human beings who care about the species that we deal with or the ecosystems that we study. And the other issue that has been a challenge to positivistic science is why are the answers sometimes wrong? We think we have this process where if we can verify results, then we move closer and closer to the truth. But then 10 years later, there's new evidence that suggests that all of that thinking was wrong. And that's just the evolution of knowledge. It sometimes has to do with the evolution of technology, what we have available to understand a problem. Nevertheless, it does call into question that through this process, we always arrive at a truth, because the truth changes. And this can become particularly obvious in some of the health research in particular. You guys won't remember, but when I was a teenager, suddenly eggs were bad, bad, bad. No one should eat eggs. 10 years later, eggs are okay again. It goes through cycles of our understanding, and that's okay. There's an evolution of knowledge and of understanding, and that's probably a more appropriate way to look at scientific advance rather than we can come to a truth at some point in time. All of this has to do with my favorite 6-syllable word, epistemology. If you make it epistemological, it's a 7-syllable word, and if anyone can think of another good 7-syllable word by the end of the class, and if you come to the Marine Lab, I'll buy you a beer, because there are not many, and this one is particularly nice. Again, we've got the ology. Epistemology is the study or theory of the nature of knowledge, both the grounds of that knowledge and especially with reference to the limits of knowledge and validity. Epistemology, if you're a positivist, you have a positivist epistemology. Right? So it's your way of viewing how knowledge is created. And one thing I want to say is that in my class, I clearly, in raising these issues to you, question the positivistic epistemology. But that doesn't mean that I'm right. And you can go through, if you were at the Marine Lab next year and took my class, and at the end of it you said, yeah, I heard all of that, but I still think we can do this. That's fine too, because I recognize that what I'm presenting to you today reflects my own theories of knowledge and understanding, which I think is a little bit more, I see knowledge as being a little bit more diverse than one that we can only arrive at through one particular means of exploration. One of the, in social sciences, which I'm from, and I'm going to start from social sciences. I realize you're not all doing social science research, so don't give up on me. I'm going to come back to you. In social sciences, there's been a real debate. The research wars are around epistemology. How does knowledge best get created? Do we need to have numbers? Is only number-based empirical evidence sufficient? Or can we have qualitative, more interpretive understandings of phenomena, actions around us. In most, so starting in the social sciences, in most social science disciplines, there was some initial approach to how things were done. I'm trained as a geographer, so I'll give you the geographer one. In history, geography actually has one of the longest histories because it's highly caught up in the process of exploration and colonization. The men in shorts that went out on the ships and colonized far-off places were geographers. Part of what they were doing was mapping where they were going, describing the places that they went, and it was all fairly qualitative. It was a description. Von Humboldt went to Latin America and described Latin American landscapes, cultures, economies, peoples, etc. In sociology, you saw things like case study approaches. In psychology, individual psychoanalysis. So all disciplines have some kind of historical background of what they did. Whoops. Let me just go back. And then we experienced what was typified as a quantitative revolution. And this typically for social sciences came in the 1960s, partly through increased computing power, not the nice little desktops that we all have now, but increased computing power allowed people to handle larger data sets. And there was a movement in, for example, in my discipline, a movement from this aerial kind of regional descriptive studies to spatial statistical analysis. And now that GIS is so popular, you're all doing spatial statistical analysis, but it really started in geography back in the 1960s. In the 1980s, there was kind of a qualitative backlash against this. And the argument wasn't, if you can't put numbers on it, it was an argument that putting numbers on something was okay and useful and told us something, but it couldn't tell us everything. That numbers could only take us so far in understanding a particular problem. Now this is where I want to appeal to the natural scientists who are thinking, yeah, but I don't deal with people, so it's not an issue for me. Well, there's a pecking order in the natural sciences as well, and let me tell you, ecology is not at the top of the order. There's beliefs that ecology, working in real-world ecosystems where replication is really difficult. You might be able to move an animal into the lab, but you can't move their whole ecosystem in. So you can't really do positivistic experimental science for many ecological problems, where the whole underlying principle of ecology is that we're interested in interactions between ecosystems and species. So while I've talked about how these kind of hierarchizations, that might have been a six-letter one as well, six-syllable one as well, in social sciences, there's also a hierarchy in the natural sciences. And I would argue that in most cases, those hierarchies serve us no purpose. They don't help us progress. And part of my pitch here is to just forget about them, but I'll come back to that. I want to give you an example, and because this is how I run my classes, I'm going to make you speak, some of you anyway, of what I mean by this difference between the limitations of a quantitative versus a qualitative approach. And I'm going to give you an example, a geographic example, again, because I'm a geographer by training. But let me just tell you a little bit about the unfortunately named Fallis's work. This was an undergraduate thesis done at the university I previously worked at in Canada, the University of Western Ontario. And this is the City of London. Can anyone tell me just off the top, so we've got city, the city is the odd-shaped thing in the middle. Just by looking at that, can anyone tell me what they think they're seeing? What is this map trying to tell us? Okay. One person from there can speak on behalf, yes.
I thought it was the rate of the average income of each census block, tract, whatever, to the overall average of the city.
That's right. Anyone else? Other things that it's showing up there? Right, so we've got income distribution. Why I said that's actually right is because it's not very well labeled. This is a map of income distribution across little squares. Anyone want to guess what the squares are? Census blocks. The numbers in the squares mean nothing. This was probably all census block 6, and now it's been broken down as the population has grown. It's not a great legend because it is average income compared to a London average. So if you're in one of the dark squares, I know it's not very clear, so I'll read it out. You're making over 140% of the average income. If you're in a light one, you're less than 60% of the average income. So what kind of trends do you see in these data? You don't have to be geographers to be able to read a choropleth map. What kind of trends do you see here? Money is in the outskirts? So we got a pretty typical vision of North American city development, right? Inner city, downtown core, with low incomes. Development in the north of the city with expanding suburbs, and in the west of the city. You can see section 35, for example, in the middle. You're getting into a little bit of gentrification, older neighborhoods picking up again. But there is this clear geographic distribution in the city. What's interesting in this is that east, let me just tell you, it's a little anecdote for Friday afternoon. London is a population about 350,000. I think we have about 1 murder a year, tops. Pretty safe city. But the east of the city, it takes on, I don't know anything about Durham, but are there areas that just develop this mystical, thou shalt not ever go there? In London, it was called east of Adelaide. And Adelaide was a street that runs sort of here. And anything east of Adelaide was, you're going east of Adelaide. Very scary, very dangerous. You might be the one person in London murdered that year. And the first time I went, I was absolutely shocked because you know what I saw in the east of Adelaide? This is not a very pleasant thing to say about Canada, which I normally brag about too. I saw a lot of ethnic restaurants, ethnic food stores. It's an immigrant area, essentially. I don't know that crime is that much higher. I know that the house prices are a lot cheaper. But it's taken on this mythical proportions of where people live. So what we can know about the numbers, right? The numbers tell us there's high income development in the north and the west. There's inner city decay with some, maybe in some places, some gentrification, some picking up. And that the east of the city is also in this lower income bracket. You could probably get the census data that also told you what I just told you, that a lot of immigrants, London was a clearinghouse for Latin American immigrants in the 1980s when many countries in Latin America were in civil war. So we had a lot of El Salvadorian immigrants, a lot of Guatemalan immigrants who came to London because it was one of the cities that Canada was channeling immigrants through. So you could probably, even from census data, lay out something like ethnic identity of households. You could get that far. The critique of the qualitative backlash came from a number of different angles, and I'm just going to give you two. I'm going to give you a humanist critique of it and a Marxist critique of it. I know that's a dirty word these days, but I'll give you the Marxist critique of it as well. The humanist critique of this was, okay, we see these patterns, but we don't really know why they occur or what they mean. Actually, let's go backwards. Why they occur. We'll do the Marxist critique. We don't really know why this concentration has occurred. Marxists are typically interested with large-scale political and economic structures that dictate how resources are used and where people go. So what kind of, can you imagine any political, economic, legal things that would influence this particular distribution of people in a place like London? Let's go someone up on this side because you guys have been so quiet hiding behind the cameraman. Any ideas? You're moving to a city like London and you're looking around. Any kind of structural issues that might influence where you live? Yeah. So looking at school systems, you're looking for a good school. Any links to what good schools tend to be associated with? Property taxes and property values. So there's a tax system in place here. You move to London and you think, oh, I'd really like to live up north because there's a mall there and that's where my job is. But I can't afford a house, and even if I could afford the house, I couldn't afford the property taxes. Other issues that might influence where people live, structural issues? Yeah. Transportation, bus systems, right? If you don't have your own car, you have to go to the part of the city that's best served with buses. And if there's only one bus, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, that goes out to the western suburbs, you're pretty much restricted to living in the downtown core to the east where the buses are more dense. So there are these structural issues that dictate this pattern that just looking at the census data doesn't allow us to understand, doesn't unveil those relationships. A humanist critique might say, okay, what is the experience of an El Salvadorian refugee coming to London and moving into a particular neighborhood? So on a much more human or individual level, why would someone, like you're a refugee from war and you move to Canada and you migrate to the east end of the city? What might be some of the influences that take you there? Yeah? So if there's already a concentration of Latin American or El Salvadorians in particular there, you might be attracted to that. Why? Another reason related to that, what's one of the key advantages of that? Language is one of them. Other things though, services, churches set up, government extension programs to offer language training for immigrants might be located in those particular areas. What is the experience of someone coming from a war-torn country, having seen incredible sort of destruction, maybe lost some of their family members, moving to this affluent middle-class city in Canada and living on the peripheral of that city? So the humanist critique, again, was that, fine, you can tell me that the Latin Americans live on the east half of the city, but you can't really tell me why, and you can't tell me what that experience is all about. So again, it's not to say that the census data and the looking at it spatially distributed in statistics doesn't tell us something, but it doesn't tell us everything, that there are other interesting questions to ask that empirical number crunching might not necessarily be the best way to ask them. So let's go back then. So I've talked about, we've got these divisions in research, which I would argue are really unproductive. I want to go back to our definitions of research, and this is where your grammar test comes in. Anyone who is really good at grammar, we're looking for, you take those three definitions, adverbs or adjectives that strike you as common between them. What are the key adverbs and adjectives here? Systematically, you got it. Consistent, in that case, an adjective. And then systematic and systematically, right? So regardless, we're looking for some kind of systematic. It's not random, it's not haphazard, regardless of the type of research that you're doing. The action, not always formed as a verb, but the action basis of these. Asking questions, exploration and study, seeking answers, which is another way, I guess, of answering questions. So again, what's all this action is the investigation, the uncovering. One of the things that I think distinguishes these, sorry, my colors aren't that great for showing up, is that the first two also emphasize our ability to find answers or establish facts, where the last one doesn't put so much emphasis on this establishing facts or finding answers. And I think the second half of this definition suggests why. That the author in this particular publication was really aware that there is this battle over methodology, our ability to discover truth. And so they sort of stay away from this notion that we're going to establish some kind of fact or truth, that the real importance of the research process is in the finding the good questions and trying to answer those. So I would say one of the key differences in approaches to research, and one that I'm not going to try and convince you one is better than the other, is the extent to which we accept what we find as truth, representing reality. So if I go in and study something like the humanist dimensions of Latin American refugees in London, I can come back and say, this is the story, versus coming back and saying, this is one interpretation of the story. An interpretation that recognizes that I was asking the questions, non-Latin American person, to these people who may have had reasons for answering or not answering my questions, that it took place at a particular time and place. If I did the research in the 1980s during the refugee influx, I would get very different answers than 20 years later when the refugees are settled and established in London. So the extent to which we think we can arrive at an ultimate truth versus one interpretation of the truth at a particular time and in a particular context. Having said that, I think my most important rule that I argue, what I do argue with my students, is that choosing between different approaches to research should ultimately be a decision about what the best approach is. In this program, we tend to get lots of people, or at least this year in my methods class, I have lots of students who come from a natural science background, trained in natural sciences, trained to collect numbers, conduct statistical analyses, do their modeling, which is great. But then they identify a problem or a question that may be not best answered using those methods. And they struggle with that. But I'm quantitative. How can I possibly address this in a qualitative manner? And it's a manner of finding the best way to get at the question that you're interested in. Many questions, I would argue, can be addressed using both types of approaches, singly or simultaneously, using a mixed method approach. And what I try and convince students to do is minimize their biases or biases about which is the best one, based on some pre-assumptions about the value of quantitative data, hard science versus soft science, all those dichotomies we aim to get rid of in my course. That really it's about finding out what's best for the problem that you identify and being open to doing that. You can address a great question with the wrong method and not be any further ahead. So I guess opening up your mind to the possible ways of approaching a research problem, particularly when you're working in an interdisciplinary program like this. So that's the theory, philosophy, research wars type. And what I want to do for the next bit is talk about how we might actually conceptualize a research question, what types of research questions that we can ask. This is kind of the more practical part of the lecture. I will get off my philosophy horse. I'm going to start by talking about different types of inquiry. And again, I'm distinguishing here between the research question and the approach to asking a research question. And I'm going to try and make it obvious how I'm distinguishing between these two as I go through. I'm going to use the example of climate change as I go through these. So different types of inquiry. First of all, we can try and understand a phenomenon. And as I said, I'm going to use climate change for all these. We might try and understand the phenomena of climate change. And that could involve a variety of different things, but we're really interested in the actual phenomena itself. As opposed to, for example, looking at a presumed relationship. And I'm using climate change through all of these just to show you the subtle differences. And I know very little about climate change, so those of you who know more can take me to pieces for it. But so we might, in looking at a presumed relationship, for example, look at the relationship between anthropogenic activity and climate change. So our focus isn't on the phenomena itself, but on this presumed relationship between two different issues or two different components of the climate change issue. We may look at a controversy. Again, with climate change, we could look at the controversy around climate change. Is it happening? Isn't happening? What are the arguments for or against on those? We could look at a theory or a concept. For example, we could look at how climate change relates to theories about predicted changes in sea level rise. This might involve doing some modeling, some prediction. And again, these are just examples of how we might look at a theory or a concept as a form of inquiry, as a form of a research project. Or we might look at the process itself. trying to understand the process of global climate change, the various mechanisms, points along the process that contribute to climate change. Okay, so that's sort of 5 different types, and it's not an exhaustive list. I'm just picking some of the most common. Looking at a phenomenon itself, I've used climate change. We could say the phenomenon is poverty. Okay? A presumed relationship, again, I use climate change. It could be a presumed relationship between levels of education and poverty. A controversy. I'm pulling the poverty ones off the top of my head now, so this ought to get good. A controversy over something like whether or not poverty can be alleviated with current tax reforms or not. What's the best tax mechanisms to invoke to reduce poverty? A theory or concept, theories of poverty and movement out of poverty into different classes as you move up a ladder. Or a process, how people become impoverished. You can tell I'm pulling these out of the air here. But that there's these general areas that are distinct in the approach you take to a problem, and that will have implications for how you do the work. I want to try and distinguish between these different approaches to problems, these different types of inquiry that you might do, and the types of research that you might do. And again, I'll try and make it clear the distinctions between these. First of all, you could do descriptive research. Descriptive research could involve, think of what historians do typically. You're using historical documents to piece together a story, to tell that story, to describe it. Often when you're looking at something new that's little understood, a new phenomena, for example, describing the phenomena itself is an important thing to do. So climate change, we're sort of beyond describing that phenomena, but at some point, someone had to say, hey, there's this phenomena going on, and I'm going to be the one to describe it. You can do empirical work, where empirically you might try and use numbers to, sorry, it's a data-driven exercise, which you're making, I'll just take a moment and breathe, where the data is driving the research. So you're measuring something, right? And many of you probably aren't going to be measuring climate change, but you go out and measure something and you use those numbers as the basis of what you're doing in your research. You can take a theoretical approach where your focus is on either challenging new theory, developing new theory, evaluating existing theory. So really what you're looking at is the theory is the most important part of what you're doing. You can be conceptual, where you develop models, for example. Models of how decisions are made. I'm going to go back to one of my climate change examples. I've just remembered how I thought I would make this more clear, because I don't feel like I'm being very clear at the moment. Or you can be normative or evaluative. Normative, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, just means sort of the ideal, what things should be. If you believe in a normative approach, you have some vision of what something should be. And I'm going to stress it because a lot of MPs end up being normative. That you do something like, you take something like environmental impact assessment, and you develop a framework. And you say, to be a good environmental impact assessment, you should do the following things. And then you apply that framework to a particular project, to a particular assessment. So you set up a standard. And a lot of policy work, so for those of you doing policy, a lot of it involves setting up what's the ideal, and how close does this policy or this project come to meeting that ideal. Let me just go back a few slides and give you specific examples about how any of these types of research could be used under any of those types of inquiry. Even though we have an overlap in the word theoretical, for example, it's different when you're talking about it as a type of research versus a form of inquiry. And I hope I'll make that clear when I go back to, I'm going to take the example, that one, of the pro and anti-climate change argument. So descriptive, you could just describe what the arguments are on both sides. You could, gather all the relevant policy documents by pro and anti and basically summarize the basis of the argument, a fairly descriptive approach to understanding the problem. Empirically, One of the things you might do is survey people on beliefs about climate change and factors contributing to climate change and where it's going to come from. So your area of inquiry is this controversy, but your approach to research is empirical. You're going to present data that suggest X% of people believe climate change is happening, Y% don't, and these are the important factors in that analysis. Your analysis is based on that empirical evidence rather than on the description of the controversy itself. Theoretically, you could apply theories of economic theories to try and understand approaches to climate change. You could look at something like Kyoto and say, I'm going to try and understand different countries' visions of Kyoto or commitment to Kyoto using an economic theory or risk assessment or risk aversion, and look at risk aversion as a tool or a theory that can help us explain why some countries will sign on to Kyoto and other ones won't. So again, your emphasis then is on the theory that can help us explain the controversy rather than on describing or measuring the controversy itself. Conceptually, you might try and develop a model to explain decision-making about climate change. So looking at a particular country or even at a business level, what kind of steps businesses take to prepare for any perceived or eventual restrictions they see on their activities based on impending legislation or lack of legislation. So you might try and develop a model. If A happens, companies will do action B. And once we have B, we have 3 other decisions that we might make. So again, it's looking at, you're still looking at the controversy, but your approach is a conceptual development approach rather than theoretical, empirical, or descriptive. And finally, on a normative or an evaluative scale, you might say, what I'm really interested in is understanding conflict resolution, possible resolution of conflicts around the climate change issue, and I'm going to set up a conflict resolution ideal and apply that to this particular scenario. So lots of different ways to address a particular problem, and I think the really important issue is to make sure, given that there are all these different approaches you could take to the issue and all of these different mechanisms of research that you could employ, is to be clear on them and not to try and do too much, which is typically a problem in many research projects. Got a little bit ahead of myself on that one, but we're almost through the actual research skills section. I think that one of the key skills, overlooked, understated, is an ability to identify and perceive a question of interest to you. And this is why we go back to that initial models where they all talked about knowing the literature, knowing the theory, knowing the background. That helps in identifying and perceiving those research questions that are most relevant. I can't tell you the number of times students come to me and say, this is a question I'm interested in, these are the data that I have, and the 2 don't match. That's probably one of the biggest struggling points people come to. So making sure that your questions can be answered, that it's not too big a question, and that you know what data you need to answer it. The second issue, justifying, contextualizing, and linking questions, is telling us why your question matters. And again, this goes back to that initial understanding of the literature, of the theory, to make sure that you can tell us why it matters beyond the very specific case in which you're working. Identifying, practicing, and describing methods is what you do, right? It's the action, it's the activity of doing the MP, generating the data, and describing the methods, regardless of what approach you take, is critical in that process. Analyzing and contextualizing data, again, we're going back full circle to that why is that top step, that knowing the literature, knowing the background important. You have to be able to make sense of your results. You have to tell us what they mean. It may seem really straightforward and obvious, but when I start to talk about some of the limits of the way the MP sometimes gets done, I hope to show you why that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Making conclusions and presenting findings, which isn't on the screen. This comes back to the professional element of what you're doing, be able to put your things across in an articulate as opposed to me at 10 to 4 on a Friday afternoon, manner with minimums of ums and ahs and grammatical errors, all of those kinds of things. These are the skills that you need to be able to properly or effectively conduct research at any level, including the MP. The last thing I want to talk about is this MEM dilemma. The dilemma that I see is the following. You're told from the beginning, MP, big important thing. This is what you should be thinking about. You're all probably trying to think about what you want to do. Supervisors have probably said, oh, sort of by Christmas, you might want to have an idea of what you're going to do. Or not. Or not. So supervisors should be encouraging you to have an idea about what you want to do. You're in a professional program, so you're interested in this internship thing. Ideally, you'd all like to line up, I'm assuming, a really well-paid internship on a topic that you're just crazy about next summer. Am I wrong? Right. So here's the scenario. You come in, and sort of by Christmas, you're thinking, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I've been taking this course. I love it. I'm going to do a project on this. I'm going to find the money for it, and I'm going to execute it over the summer. And you start doing all that background reading, right? Campbell told me I have to know the theory. I have to know the background. My supervisor says that. I'm set. And in March, you get a call. And someone says, I can pay you X amount of dollars to work for this agency for the summer to do this project that I want you to do. And you've got a trade-off here, right? Because you're putting value on being able to do this, construct this MP on your own, and also as a professional student wanting the opportunity to network, to make a buck, to have a face out in the real world. Maybe the internship leads to a really good job. And so in many cases with MPs, there is an opportunistic element, right? Opportunistic, just like those opportunistic feeders. It's there, I'll eat it. Hey, you know, I have this 20-page research outline of what I was going to do, but never mind, they're going to pay me $7,000 to do this. And I think that's fine, because it is a trade-off. You have there's a lot of different competing interests in the MEM program. The problem with this is that then you haven't had that time, right? So you go out and you do a question that it's almost like a consulting contract. You're working on someone that someone else has told you they want to know the answer to. And you get excited enough about doing that. You know, you go out and conduct your survey or take your measurements, whatever it is. But you're behind in that process of knowing the literature. And the real danger is that you end up writing an MP that nobody but your mother and the client wants to read. It's too specific, right? It's too driven by the opportunistic element. You haven't had the time to fill in the background, and you end up writing something that's so specific that its value is limited to that client. Now, that's not to say it doesn't have value to the client. The client may still say, hey, that was a great project. Come back and work for us when you're done. Or they may not. And then you have to say, okay, well, what did I get out of this? How can I maximize this beyond the immediate relevance to the client itself? And I think that I would argue it's never too late. You go back to the theory. You've got your data. It's a backwards process where ideally the relationship with theory, with that initial literature review, should have informed you from the start, should have informed the questions that you ask, the way you try to ask them. It doesn't always work that way. Theory can also be used to provide a framework, the guidelines for analyzing and contextualizing your results. And you never know, you may find that you have data that can challenge existing theory or lead to the creation of new theory. And I think this is an incredibly important part of the process, that as you do an MP, as you narrow it down, as you try and be relevant to an internship or to a client, all really good goals, don't lose the bigger picture. Make sure that someone else will want to read it, not because they're interested in this really specific context of your work, but because they're interested in the wider issues around it. And it's just one of those things that I think as MEM students you sort of have to manage. It's 5 to 4. I'm going to shut up shortly. I said that I wouldn't give you any recipes. What I do have are just a one-page sheet that I get my students to fill out at the beginning of our course and then at the end that I say they should always be thinking about. It's both practical and kind of philosophical, and I'll pass it around. You guys can take them and pass them back. There's something that you should be able to fill out by the time you're really starting to do your research project. For example, one of the things I found this year is that I have all of my students, once you see it, you'll see we get to question 4, how are you going to get your data? And by the time they take my course, most of them have their data, so they can answer that. And then they get to question 5, how are you going to analyze it? And they don't actually know, right? So that's one of the steps you want to make sure. I'll send some more up, please. I'm definitely off film now. Do you want to keep them going? Any questions? We have a few minutes for questions if you have questions, or we're all stunned into silence. Okay, if nobody has any questions, I'm done. You can feel free to email me if there's anything specific. I didn't give you a list of references. There are all kinds of references out there for research design, but they're tailored fairly specifically to the type of research that you're planning to do. So I didn't give you a reference list that would be useful to only a small group of you. But if you want some suggested readings, things like that, you can email me and I'll be happy to send those on. Okay? No questions? Have a good weekend. Thank you.